that Fred Korematsu's case didn't necessarily change the law, but it influenced the law. The precedent still remains on the books, but I believe that the criticism of his original case and the work of the Court of Novus cases that discredited the original cases have seriously impaired the precedent that you can take an entire group of American citizens, detain them indefinitely, put them in prison without any notice of charges or due process rights, and have that legitimized by the Supreme Court. That has actually happened in a way, but the cases afterwards have now recognize that there are due process rights even for enemy combatants or prisoners in Guantanamo. And so I think if you read some of those cases, the Supreme Court has consistently rebuffed the United States administration, denying those due process rights and trying to take away our habeas corpus rights. And have said things like, a state of war is not a blank check for the president when it comes to the rights of the nation's citizens. What's interesting about these cases is that they rarely mention Korematsu. It's like Korematsu was an embarrassment to them. And for them to cite it means that they've got to deal with all of the inconsistencies, the illogic, the unfairness, the ridiculous statements they make when they say Korematsu was not excluded because of him or antagonism to his race. That was said in his original case, and it was the most ridiculous statement I've ever seen in a Supreme Court decision. So rather than deal with Korematsu, they even talk about Korematsu as a Korematsu type situation. They don't talk about it in legal terms, they talk about it as a historical situation where 120,000 people were uprooted, exiled, without any semblance of rights. But Korematsu hasn't affected the other branches of the government, the legislative or the executive, because we now still have that abhorrent Patriot Act on the books and other legislation which has drastically curtailed our civil rights and into smaller and smaller pieces. They, in a sense, eviscerated our Fourth Amendment rights because now we have secret wiretaps, we have secret searches without warrants. They can look at your financial records, they can look at your internet uses, they can look at your medical records, they can even look at what you took out of the library. And you won't even know it because the law provides that authority for them. I don't believe you can quantify the effect of a Korematsu. I think if you do, it's subjective, and what I've seen, though, is incredibly and wonderful public education coming out of that case. Our group has probably given 1,000 speeches several thousand speeches over the time that we've had the ruling on the case. 2 movies were made. Unfinished Business by Steve Okazaki got nominated for an Academy Award. And then Of Civil Wrongs and Rights, which you just saw a portion of, won several Emmy Awards. And as much as we like to believe how effective we are speaking, it's so much easier to pop a DVD and show it to 100 people, and you have way greater effective education. Fred Korematsu's name has been associated. In fact, 2 schools have been named after Fred Korematsu. In Seattle, the Seattle University has created a Fred Korematsu Center for Justice, led by Catherine Bonai's sister, Lori Bonai, both of whom were members of our original Korematsu team, our Korenovus teams. There's a Korematsu chair, professorship at the University of Hawaii, and it's occupied by Eric Yamamoto, who was another member of our Korematsu team. The Asian Law Caucus was also part of our team, as a Fred Korematsu Institute. And all these groups will continue to do education, organizing, litigation, so the name goes on. The younger generation of people who are now choosing Fred Korematsu as their model, as their hero, to do research on and to educate other people on is really surely a sign of hope. And I know redress itself has affected other movements. The Japanese redress movement has been cited as a precedent for correcting terrible wrongs. The Hawaiian self-government movement, mismanagement of land, Native American lands, the Korean comfort women, African-American slavery, the Bracero itinerant farm workers deportation, Filipino war veterans. The redress has always been mentioned, or has been mentioned as a precedent as to why these groups should get justice as well. Whether we can measure concrete results flowing from redress is not so important to me because the alternative to doing nothing is simply unacceptable. If you can't quantify the value of education about the Holocaust? Do you sit silently if it happens again? When you know that the education work has etched a vision of injustice and the horror of prejudice on the consciousness of this whole entire world community. We know there's no such thing as a permanent victory. The reality of the Holocaust has challenged every generation by ignorant, by anti-Semites, by revisionists, just like the Japanese-American incarceration is challenged in every generation. Events in history move like a flow like a river, and we need to be in that flow. And that's why we have these days of remembrances every year, to be part of that flow. And an only lasting victory can occur through continual activism and education. That means we should tell and retell our stories, because there are people who have never heard of the imprisonment of Japanese Americans. There are ignorant people like Chris referred to, and there are those who just don't care. But let's not repeat them in the same old words, the same framework, or they become a monotonous refrain that is so easily ignored. We need to tell these stories in new ways. We need to see and present the incarceration with fresh eyes and new voices to engage the attention of the public by updating the relevance of the Japanese-American experience. I thought about Anne Frank the other day. She's a Jewish girl who was trying to avoid the Nazi death camps. So she and her family hid in an attic in Amsterdam to avoid capture. And in that attic, for the year they were there, they had a small window. Through that window, she could see a portion of the sky and a big chestnut tree, part of the tree. And for her, that was a symbol of her freedom. It was also gave her solace that someday she might be free. It was only a connection with the outside world. But her family was captured. They were sent to camps where she passed away and died. She died. Over the years, the tree began dying. And they were about to cut it down when people moved to save the tree. What they did was they cut shoots of that tree off, and they sent them around the world to be planted. And one is planted in Sonoma, in Northern California. And what those shoots are, and the plants are, and the trees will be, are reminders, memories, in a new way of the horror of Holocaust, but a different way to reach an audience and help them remember. Similarly, I think Japanese Americans are telling their stories in new ways, which I really appreciate. I know folks in San Diego are trying to get the legislature to pass a Fred Korematsu Day. Some of them who work for Tommy is helping with that. Model on Harvey Milk's Day. He was a pioneering gay politician in San Francisco. I mentioned public schools that were named after Fred Korematsu. And the Assemblyman for Otani has also introduced a bill to give honorary degrees to the Japanese Americans who were plucked out of their colleges before they had a chance to graduate. These are new stories, and they're stories that reach the public and they remind people of what happened to Japanese Americans and to our civil rights. Tying our stories to marginalized people emphasizes the commonalities in our history and our experiences. In the process, we build bridges and connections. We also build political strength, which ensure the the endurance of the remembrance. So we should remember when Japanese Americans were subject to racial profiling, just like Muslim Americans and Arab Americans were subjected to after September 11th. We must tell that story. So in the end, let us remember the lessons. That justice is not self-executing, it is not a gift, it is a challenge. That we cannot rely on our institutions alone to protect our rights. We should remember that dissent is not the enemy of loyalty. For Fred, for Gordon, for me, for the Hard Mountain Resistors, for the 1800 Battalion, they were all dissenters. And they were acting with the noblest of motives, but they were branded traitors. They were ostracized, criticized, reviled. And yet today, we call them heroes. And history has proven them right. In 1942, very few people dissented from the decision to imprison Japanese Americans. The President issued Executive Order 9066. Congress passed a law immediately to support him. The Supreme Court acquiesced immediately, and we had a civil rights disaster. We should remember that it is our political birthright to dissent. It is our unique historical legacy. It is our duty as Americans. So thank you for inviting me here today. thrilled to be here, to honor Fred Korematsu, to be in this day of remembrance, to celebrate what we have won, how far we have come, and to renew our commitment to continue walking together on that road to social justice.